So I'm responding to a comment on this TikTok video that I posted.
The government doesn't have the authority to grant rights. Anything that requires funding simply can't be a right.
So this is the comment which closes out with this question: do we have a right to survive without working? But we're going to look at the full context. Fanny's basically saying the government has the authority to do whatever it wants because it has the ability, which I would argue are two different things, but I'm not arguing what Fanny's saying isn't happening. But I go on to say, in the circumstance that our government can't financially afford to provide a thing, it's possible that someone might have to be forced to do the labor required to provide that thing. Which brings us back to the comment in question. Fanny said, in that case, all labor is stripping someone of their rights. We are all coerced by circumstance to labor against our will to survive. Do we have a right to survive without working? Now, this is where I'm going to provide my wholehearted, honest answer. No, you don't have the legal right to survive without working, because that would be impossible to sustain if everyone decided to exercise that right. Which makes sense because it's not even a right in a fundamental kind of way. I would go as far as to say the opposite, in that you actually have the right to work to survive. Now, in the case that you're talking about the coercion being corporations and individuals like Jeff Bezos taking advantage, that's different. You have the right to not be put under those circumstances which make it impossible for you to survive. That's different than the right to just survive without working. Well, why does Jeff Bezos have that right? I don't think anyone has the right to survive without working, including people like Bezos. But we're not talking about that case. We're talking about the case where the government can't afford these things. There wouldn't be billionaires because then we would be able to afford it. Even in that case, fundamentally speaking, you still wouldn't have the right to just survive without working. In fact, without any government, just as a human being, as a living creature, you wouldn't have the right to survive without working. Yes, there's still that coercion that you would have to work in order to survive. As long as it's not an individual or a government doing it, that's not really on us. That's part of the human experience. That's what makes us human. That's what validates our humanity. There wouldn't be an issue with people starving because it would just be a fundamental right, which it isn't. Someone has to work for it. It would be great if it was. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be. It would be awesome if that was the case. However, it's not the case. But we're not talking in a fundamental sense. We're talking in a legal sense. And in a legal sense, not only can you not fund a right, but you can't explicitly grant or restrict a right. I'm going to simplify it in the most easy way. Anything that we pass as legislation, whether it's an amendment or meant to protect a right that we want to be protected, it is written as a restriction and or a requirement. Most of the time it is both. I'm going to give you a few examples of this. Now, this is an example of a restriction without a requirement. It's a simple one. It's just a smoking restriction in Santa Monica. Now, you might be thinking it requires a fine in order for this to work. However, that's not what I mean by require, and that'll be shown in my next example, which is Wheat versus the United States, which you probably know as the right to an attorney. This is an example of a requirement without a restriction. It was found to be against the 6th article of the Bill of Rights to not let him choose his attorney. However, the right to an attorney isn't actually a right to an attorney, but a requirement that is needed in order to help secure the assurance of a fair trial, as you can see that I already explained to my friend here. However, if the government is required to give you an attorney as well as the right to choose one in order to make sure you have a fair trial, then why not restrict private lawyers? It's common knowledge that hiring a private lawyer has its advantages over taking a state-appointed lawyer. Why is this allowed to go unrestricted? How does that guarantee a fair trial when private attorneys give you an unfair advantage based on whether or not you can afford one? Shouldn't this be an example of restrict and require? Instead, it just requires something without the proper restrictions, effectively making it useless. If it did have the proper restrictions, it would be a perfect example of restriction and requirement. But it doesn't, so it's not. What is a perfect example of restriction and requirement is the restriction of driving a motor vehicle and the requirement of a driver's license in order to bypass that restriction. As opposed to the cigarette restriction, it's just a restriction because there's nothing that is required to bypass it. You can't get a license or a permit to bypass it. Now, what's perfect for restriction and requirement is different for requirement and restriction. Now, you might think I'm just clowning around and this is just the same thing pretty much, but this is more on the lines that the requirement makes a restriction restriction as opposed to the restriction having some sort of requirement to bypass it. I think the perfect example for requirement and restriction would be the requirement for heated housing, which ultimately becomes a restriction on what you can't have for your house. Very few might argue that this is an infringement on any of your fundamental rights, so let's take a look at something that a lot of people consider to be their fundamental rights. Abortion, for example, is seen to be a fundamental right. Not only that, but it's a staple of women's rights and is seen by many to be an overall human right. Many would also see Roe versus Wade being overturned as a detriment to that right. However, many would also say that overturning Roe v. Wade is a necessity to protect those same exact rights. Some going as far as to writing books about how it's a human rights issue, with topics allegedly linking abortion to supporting euthanasia as well as Nazi ideology. Some considering it a human rights violation. Also, before we continue, I don't want anyone in the comment section arguing about abortion. I was just using this as an example. If you want to know more about what I think about that, I have videos discussing that exact topic. My point is that there are people that think Roe v. Wade and the abortion access it provided is important for protecting women's rights. There are also people who believe that Roe v. Wade and the abortion access it provided is an attack towards women's rights. Both of those claims can't be right. However, it's explicitly doing neither of those things. It's simply a bunch of restrictions and requirements, and the interpretation of those restrictions and requirements determines whether or not someone believes it's attacking or preserving women's rights. Some might even consider this to be a restriction against women's rights. Maybe this example is too controversial. Let's look at a different example. Let's look at the Bill of Rights and the 10 articles of it. These are also just requirements and restrictions and not actually your rights. Taking a look at the second article in particular, even though it does state that it's a right, that statement was put there for the sole purpose of showing what these requirements and restrictions were intended for in the first place. A well-regulated militia is the requirement, meaning it needs to be regulated in some way. Maybe those who raise red flags aren't part of the militia. The restriction is the right of the people to keep and bear arms, not to be infringed. The restriction, however, protects the individual's rights while simultaneously putting the burden of the actual restriction on anyone who wants to go against those rights. But overall, Article 2 of the Bill of Rights isn't actually your rights in legislative form. That doesn't exist, because anything that isn't explicitly restricted or prohibited is assumed to be your right by default, which brings us to this. I'm going to keep this brief because I explained all this already, and Devin likes to play on the slippery slope, but basically Devin's saying if the government can't afford an attorney for you, then they can't afford to prosecute you, which I go on to say that if we didn't have all these convoluted laws, you wouldn't need an attorney for there to be a fair trial. However, Devin insists that we need a bunch of laws in order to make sure things aren't too narrow and people are understanding of what their rights actually are. Which leads me back to these amendments, the 9th and 10th Amendment. The 9th one specifically because it says anything that isn't written down as a right doesn't necessarily mean it isn't a right, and that it needs to be either prohibited already or become prohibited through due process. And it's like that for a good reason. For instance, there's no law explicitly telling you that you have the right to blow bubbles. I understand that right isn't brought up in the questioning, but just bear with me. The fact that nothing listed is implied to be a right unless it's already prohibited is a good thing, because that prevents our legislators and the people that are in political power from coming up with random laws and enforcing them on us without our consent in a discreet manner. That way, if somebody wanted to put into question if blowing bubbles isn't a right, at least it's out in the open, and we also have the opportunity to fight back against it, so ultimately we don't need as many laws as what you're saying. Here we are at the slippery slope about being attacked randomly and if you have the right not to be. Like I said, your rights are implied unless prohibited, and I don't know why I have to show this, but assault's already prohibited, and so is attempted murder. Devin insists that there's no reason to console the government if they're not able to grant you rights, basically saying since your rights are implied, unless they're prohibited, somehow assault is okay, even though it's prohibited. Also, the 6th Amendment is here to protect you if something like that does happen, where your rights are infringed upon, whether it's the government or another individual. Anyway, Devin's persistence on this continues. I don't know why. Like I said, anything that isn't prohibited is implied to be a right. That means you can't just be randomly attacked. No one has the right to do that to you. The obvious violent crimes are covered here. They probably have been for a while. In fact, they are probably adopted into our law before the War of Independence even ended. Devin then comes to the conclusion that it's fine to force people to do labor as long as that labor is used to protect their right to not be randomly, I assume, attacked is what they're saying. Moving on, there's a comment by this person who goes by NS that pretty much says that I'm making things up. I'm not really sure in regards to what. And we already talked about our current circumstance makes it necessary for them to provide that. Anyway, I'm out of time. If there's anything I missed, let me know in the comment section.